The scariest drugs you've never heard of. Our drug series has been a fan favorite since day one. We had the craziest drugs you've never heard of, more crazy drugs you've never heard of, the deadliest drugs you've never heard of, and now the scariest. But I'll let you guys in on a little secret. All of these drugs are deadly, scary, crazy, and gross. With that being said, today's video likely has some of the most unknown drugs I've ever talked about. Some of these drugs are scary because of where they come from, some of them are scary because of what they do to you, and some of them are scary because of what happens after you take them. Regardless, we're going to discuss them all. Let's get started. 25I-NBOME. Quite the name, and for short, we'll just call it 25I. Some other popular nicknames are N-Bomb and Smiles, both odd. 25I was first synthesized in 2003 for research purposes, but it only took the drug community about 7 years for it to become popular. In 2010, it began to circulate the recreational drug scene due to the psychedelic effects associated with it, but unfortunately, it was often misrepresented as LSD, which is extremely dangerous for reasons we'll get into. 25I is a potent phenethylamine and is deadly in doses as low as a milligram. This chemical has caused significantly more deaths and dangerous responses than your run-of-the-mill psychedelic. And although it typically comes on blotters and does have a psychoactive effect similar to LSD, that is really where the similarities end. 25I is typically sold as LSD because to the unsuspecting consumer, the effects may be similar. And 25I is considerably cheaper than LSD, giving the distributor an incentive to misrepresent the drug for a profit. However, this fact alone causes a lot of the danger and is a considerable reason why there has been so many deaths and injuries associated with this compound. 25I is potent, and I mean very potent. And unfortunately, that means that there is a very high risk of overdose, specifically when you are taking high doses of this drug. Even the margin between a moderately high dose and an overdose is razor thin. And if you are taking blotters that are not evenly distributed, you could think you're taking a low to moderate dose, but in reality, actually taking a dose that will potentially kill you without you even knowing. This story alone is a great example why people who take recreational drugs should always have them tested, because it could truly save your life. And although the potential life-threatening toxicity and death associated from this drug being either abused or misrepresented as a completely different compound are extremely scary, that's not where the story ends. Obviously, taking this drug and dying is the worst outcome, but it's not the only bad outcome that can happen if you take this compound. Let's focus in a bit on the actual experience of this compound. This drug not only produces visual changes, but can also produce auditory, tactile, and smell-based hallucinations, which to me sounds hilarious and irritating. Like, imagine you just keep smelling something, especially if it's a negative smell and you can't identify the source of where it's coming from. That alone would probably drive me mad. And it is commonly reported that trips on this substance are overwhelming and dysphoric, with some sensations being described as confusion and anxiety, thought loops, the inability to complete basic tasks. And that's on the light end. On the darker end of things, this drug can cause delirium, which could be extremely dangerous for the user itself and those around the user. This is because these delirious states are typically accompanied with aggression and agitation. Due to the sheer intensity of this substance, it is not uncommon for people to experience HPPD or dissociation. HPPD, for those who don't know, means hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, which essentially is the experience of subtle visual cues that they experienced on psychedelics for days, weeks, months, or even years after they took their psychedelic. Typically, this manifests as some sort of visual static, and the specific reason for this happening is unknown, which to me sounds terrifying. When taken sublingually, which basically just means under your tongue or cheek, this drug can last up to 10 hours. And with the negative effects that it's typically reported to have, that's not something I would even want to consider. And I guess kind of a fun fact, if you watched our last video about the deadliest drugs you've never heard of, then you heard me talk about 2CB, which is obviously in the 2C family of drugs. I bring this up because 25I is actually a 2C derivative, which I'm assuming at least a few of you knew. Oh yeah, and I didn't even talk about the physical effects of this drug. Besides the potential terrifying mental experience you could have for up to 10 hours, physically, besides dying, you could also experience seizures, rhabdomyolysis, metabolic acidosis, renal failure, and even coma. And in rarer cases, thrombosis. Due to the nature of this drug being a relatively obscure research chemical, it's hard to pinpoint a lot of information about the exact effects on the human body. However, I was able to gather some user experiences from a popular popular drug forum. One user stated his frustration with this drug even existing simply because of the dangers it proposed with its misrepresentation, claiming, quote, "The very existence of the NB-OME series pisses me off. It's super hard to get real acid now, at least where I live. Most people have no idea that there are dangerous replacements for acid, including the dealers. They seriously think they're selling LSD when they're actually selling 2,5-I NB-OME. This is obviously concerning due to the high likelihood of overdose risk, especially if you think you're taking LSD, which has a much lower risk for overdose, and death for that matter." Another user went on to share their exact experience with the drug by going on to write, quote, "I did this on Halloween with 2 of my friends. We each took 1 tab. Almost immediately I started feeling the effects, and it felt like I was peaking off of 2 tabs. It was enjoyable for like an hour, but then it really started getting bad. My friend threw up multiple times, and I was shaking uncontrollably. My heart rate was insane. My teeth were grinding and they ached. My body high made me feel like I was tweaking out on meth. The visuals were way too intense and overwhelming. I could barely walk, and I felt like I was super drunk. Every time I laid down, I had awful nausea. 4 hours in, and I started having psychosis and very dark thoughts, because I just wanted to end the trip. I couldn't even sleep for 20 hours after the trip ended. 25-I NB-OME makes you feel disgusting and coked out. The visuals feel metal and fake, and your mind feels like it's drunk. I think both of these experiences sum up the dangers and honestly the scariness of this compound as a whole. The experience sounds intense and for the most part unpleasant, to say the least. And with the risk of overdose being relatively high, especially in cases where it's being misrepresented as LSD, which unfortunately is common, the risk for an unpleasant experience is high. And the risk for death is unfortunately not unheard of. Personally, I think the scariest part about this compound is that people aren't even willingly taking it. People think they're taking LSD, but instead they are taking a relatively unknown and poorly documented research chemical with known deaths and negative effects, unknown long-term toxicity, and the potential for at the very least 10 hours of mental torture. But believe it or not, this is one of the most tame entries on this list and even in this series. So with that, let's go deeper. U47700, also known as pink. This drug is a dangerous synthetic opioid and is reported to be at least 7 to 8 times more potent than morphine. And because of that, somewhat ironically, it only takes a dose of roughly the size of the tip of your pinky to be able to kill you. But that's not why they call it pink. I'm honestly not sure why. I guess in some cases it's pink, but not to be confused with pink cocaine from our last episode on the deadliest drug. This chemical was developed by a US pharmaceutical company in the 1970s, but for reasons that are not known, the project was abandoned. This drug has never been tested at all. Not on animals, not in laboratory studies. It was synthesized, abandoned, and then seemingly randomly appeared on the illicit drug market. It is not confirmed or even known how, but it is heavily suspected that this compound's recipe has somehow gotten into the hands of illegal drug manufacturers in China, which seems likely due to the fact that a lot of extremely strong, deadly synthetic opioids are produced overseas in illegal drug factories that are unfortunately shipped directly to the United States. In 2016, this drug had a pretty major news circulation due to the fact that it was responsible for the death of 2 13-year-old boys in Utah, which is obviously extremely upsetting and unfortunate. But another even more high-profile death associated with this drug is actually Prince. Prince's formal cause of death was a fentanyl overdose, but according to sources close to the investigation, U47700 was also found in his body. Not exactly a trip report, but one scary experience associated with this drug involves a 41-year-old woman simply looking to heal her back pain. It is claimed that a woman with chronic back pain was taking a prescription drug known as Norco, and when her prescription ran out, she turned to a friend to get a few pills while she was waiting for her prescription to be refilled. And although she trusted her friend and the pills that she got from her friend looked exactly the same as her prescription pills, they were not the same whatsoever. And these were actually counterfeit drugs, not being her prescribed oxycodone painkillers, but actually being a mixture of U47700 and fentanyl. She unknowingly took these counterfeit pills in the morning, and in the passenger seat of her friend's car on the way to work, she lost consciousness and stopped breathing. She was rushed to the hospital and needed to be revived in the emergency department. Fortunately, this woman survived, but this is not the case for everybody. And it is extremely scary how someone thinking they're taking a prescription pill can actually be taking a deadly dose of an unknown substance. This story alone is a great example of why buying any sort of drug off the street is never a good idea. The effects of U47700 are pretty similar to any synthetic ultra-strong opioid, potentially causing constipation, severe and possibly fatal respiratory depression, seizures, psychosis, addiction, function, and of course, a very high risk of overdose and death. Now, if you're watching this video and you've watched every episode in the series so far, this may seem like more or less of a standard run-of-the-mill, ultra-strong synthetic opioid, and you're right. And although this drug is scary and crazy and deadly, it's not extremely different from any other designer synthetic opioid. However, I added it to this list for two reasons. One, the first drug I had in this place actually had to be removed because YouTube did not like it at all. And secondly, one thing that makes this drug rather unique, at least to me, is the fact that this drug for a long time was legal. From the 1970s all the way up until 2016, this drug was completely legal and extremely dangerous. And you can imagine when you have an extremely strong and legal opioid, there's no doubt that distributors and manufacturers of illicit substances were using this to cut other drugs or simply try to misrepresent it and sell it as heroin. In 2016, though, under an emergency act, this drug was temporarily categorized as a Schedule 1 substance, which is where it ultimately stayed. In 2015 and 2016 alone, 46 deaths were linked to this specific chemical. This drug may not be the most unique designer drug out there, but it's likely one you haven't heard of. And to me, it's definitely crazy and honestly scary how strong it is and how it was legal for so long. Moving on, Datura. At a first glance, this rather innocent looking flower seems rather nice and looks like something you may have in a bouquet, but this drug is not nearly as innocent as it seems, and it very much so deserves the nickname of the devil's trumpets. Datura is a highly poisonous flowering plant that belongs to the nightshade family. All species of Datura are extremely poisonous and psychoactive, specifically their seeds and their flowers, which, just for a brief, can cause respiratory depression, fever, delirium, hallucinations, anticholinergic syndrome, psychosis, and even death. And due to these severe effects and symptoms, Datura species of plants have occasionally been used not only as psychedelics, but also as poisons throughout history. Traditionally, around colonial times, the psychoactive effects have been associated with witchcraft and sorcery, but to some Native American groups, the Datura plant has been used ritualistically. This plant did play a semi-significant role for these two groups in the past, although knowing what we know now about this seemingly harmless plant, I cannot imagine what would have been going through these people's minds when they took it. One risk factor associated with this drug that most people don't consider is the natural variation of the toxicity depending on specific factors like the age of the plant, where it's growing, and the local weather conditions, all of which can affect how strong the toxins are within this plant. If you're paying attention, you heard me say anticholinergic, which may sound familiar if you watched our second video about crazy drugs, specifically EA3167. If you haven't seen that video, EA3167 was basically a military-funded and produced anticholinergic drug that was made as a bioweapon, which fortunately didn't see much use, but was tested on American soldiers with extremely scary effects, which if you haven't seen that video yet, watch it after this one because that story is insane. Anticholinergic drugs reduce the brain's ability to use acetylcholine, which is essential for almost every function of the brain, including memory, motor skills, thinking, and things like that. So not only do you feel like a crazy person with dementia while you take this drug, but it's also been shown that long-term use of this drug can also literally cause you to develop dementia. I think this is the first psychoactive plant we've covered in this entire series that has been used almost equally as much as a poison as it has as a psychedelic. Maybe not equally, but definitely pretty heavily in both regards. From 1950 to 1965 alone, the state chemical laboratories in India investigated over 2,700 deaths caused by ingesting Datura. And those were just the cases that were investigated, not all of them. Many of these being murders. One thing that is extremely terrifying to me is that you can accidentally consume Datura toxins simply by consuming honey from the wrong species of wasp during the Datura blooming season due to cross-pollination. I think at this point you get the idea, but we haven't even discussed what this drug is like if you take a dose that doesn't kill you and you go into it intentionally looking for some sort of psychedelic experience. Well, for starters, people that ingest Datura typically begin to experience symptoms within 30 to 60 minutes. But the psychoactive component of ingesting can last anywhere from 24 to 48 hours typically, but has also been reported to last up to 2 weeks or longer. Just imagine a 2-week-long nightmare trip. Well, that's been a reality for multiple people. Datura is considered a deliriant, which is, like I mentioned, because of the combination of anticholinergic and psychedelic toxins within this plant, which typically causes a very odd delirium state, usually causing a complete inability to differentiate dream from reality. Besides this, you may experience violent behavior, painful photophobia, muscle stiffness, disrobing, dysphoria, confusion, and amnesia, just to name a few. And considering the fact that some of these can last up to 2 weeks long, that alone sounds like hell. One user on a drug forum had this to say about Datura. You trip so hard, you don't even know that you took Datura. You forget because your memories are imaginary. You could have conversations with friends that you knew from high school, and you could just sit there for 2 hours having conversations with this good friend of yours until you realize that you never even knew this person, and there was nobody else in the room with you at all. Another user claimed, I took Datura. For the next 24 to 36 hours, I was scurrying around my house, fully convinced that there were spies watching me from the roofs of neighboring houses. I could hear them on my roof and stayed away from the windows so they couldn't watch me. And then I started seeing my ex-girlfriend who left me 2 months ago watching me from around all the corners and doors of the house, grinning maniacally, but she would disappear every time I would look. I had several panic attacks and cried from relief when it wore off and I realized I was tripping. But I didn't realize any of it was a hallucination during the experience. Horrifying stuff. I could literally go on for days reading Datura horror stories, and that's simply because almost every experience with this plant is a negative one, which shouldn't be a surprise considering this plant is literally used as a poison. I honestly don't know why anybody would even consider taking this considering all of the information that is now known about it. Literally tried to find a good trip report on this stuff. I couldn't, but it still somehow isn't even the worst entry on this list. TRAN-Q. If you thought fentanyl was scary, TRAN-Q is literally your worst nightmare. TRAN-Q gets its name because of one of its ingredients, known as xylazine. Xylazine is primarily used as a tranquilizer for large mammals, such as horses or cows. This drug was actually first synthesized in 1962 in Germany to treat hypertension, although during testing it was rather quickly shown that this was too strong and too dangerous for human consumption. The FDA denied it, and it is only approved for veterinary uses, which is of course why humans are taking it now. Although it was a wise decision to pull this drug and do no more human testing, that has left us with little to no information on how xylazine affects the human body, which will definitely play into the danger component. The exact origin of the recreational use of this drug is unknown, but at least in the United States of America, it is speculated that this was first used recreationally in Puerto Rico. But this leads to another problem, and the likely reason for this recreational use is because of access. Similar to U47700, this drug is not illegal. Because it has been approved by the FDA for veterinary uses, it is not a scheduled substance. And although it is regulated and ideally only sold to registered veterinarians, there are still shady distributors that are legally selling it online without requiring any proof of veterinary status, which, because of the lack of scheduling, makes this, for the most part, legal. Drug manufacturers and distributors for a while now have been using fentanyl to cut heroin to bring down costs. But now these same people are cutting fentanyl with xylazine to, again, keep costs down, all at the ultimate cost of the user's life. It's important to note that most people aren't just taking xylazine by itself, and TRAN-Q by definition is typically a mix of xylazine and either fentanyl, heroin, or other opioids. Although TRAN-Q has earned its own street name, the risk of it being misrepresented or taken mistakenly by users is still extremely high. Although in some rare cases, people are actively seeking out this substance due to its lower cost. Now, what exactly does TRAN-Q do to your body? Well, we've already kind of gone in depth about ultra strong synthetic opioids in this video already and other videos, so I'll keep this part brief. But it does have an extremely strong opioid effect on your body. But due to the fact that it is meant for animals literally 4 to 5 times our size, the effects are not only much stronger, but also much longer lived. With a typical opioid experience lasting anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, TRAN-Q can last anywhere from 4 to 72 hours. This drug is dangerous, and the amount of overdoses reported have been growing exponentially over the last few years alone. And it is theorized that these numbers are extremely underreported as well too, because most toxicology reports are not searching for xylazine. And because TRAN-Q is cut with xylazine and opioids, typically it's only the opioids that are attributed to the death, meaning that we really don't know how many people have lost their life because of TRAN-Q. All of this information is extremely upsetting, sad, scary, crazy, everything. But one of the most unfortunate parts about TRAN-Q is that it's essentially a death sentence if you do happen to overdose. Most antidotes for opioid overdoses will simply not be effective when you're on TRAN-Q because those antidotes have no effect on the xylazole, meaning that although the opioids may potentially be neutralized, it will likely not be enough to save someone in the case of an emergency. If you watched our last video about the deadliest drugs you've never heard of, then you've heard about a certain zombie drug, Flocka. Well, TRAN-Q is also another zombie drug, which causes similar tissue damage. TRAN-Q essentially eats your body from the inside out, causing cellular death and necrosis in multiple parts of your body, causing you to essentially gain the appearance of a zombie with deep open wounds that are very likely to be very infected. Necrosis in the injection site has always been a risk, but for TRAN-Q, you don't even have to inject it to get these horrible effects. So yeah, TRAN-Q basically just seems like a horrible combination of Flocka and fentanyl, killing your mind and body and potentially even you simultaneously. Moral of the story, if something is used to sedate horses and cows, it's probably not meant for humans at all. GBL. GBL is a chemical that is used in cleaning solutions and nail polish. However, this chemical isn't popular because of what it does to your floors or nails. It's used because your body actually turns GBL into something you've likely heard of, GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate. GHB has been used for many things, both nefarious and personal uses. This drug is exceedingly popular within the club community due to its social and euphoric effects. In low doses, it's reported to have an alcohol-like effect, making people feel social, and in higher doses can make people feel hypersexual with almost no inhibitions. However, a huge danger of this drug is the dosing, because the response curve on this drug is exponential, meaning that if you just take 10% more of what would be considered a normal dose, you could have an overdose due to your body's exponential response to this compound. Unlike some of the other entries on this list, GBL is actually a Schedule 1 substance, although it has other purposes, so it is illegal in the US. But as you know, this doesn't mean that people aren't taking it. It is important to note that GBL and GHB are not the same, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to be using the information interchangeably as GBL turns into GHB in your body and has very similar effects. Some of the biggest risk factors associated with GBL is the fact that the dosage is small, meaning that only milliliters of this can get you high and even kill you, due to, like I mentioned, the exponential curve in response. Doing precise measurements in a club setting is not ideal and also not common, which makes a lot of room for danger. How this drug typically goes about killing its users during an overdose is simply by respiratory depression and slowed heart rate, either resulting in a coma or just straight up death. In more tame cases, this drug is only known to make you black out completely, remembering absolutely nothing, which is why it was used for very, very unsavory purposes. Not only will you not remember what happens after you pass out, but you likely won't remember what happened at all that entire night. GHB is extremely addictive, and most people that have taken this drug know somebody that has died because of this drug. I'm assuming most of you watching this video likely have some level of familiarity with this chemical, and may even be disappointed that this is the last entry on this list. But the reason why I wanted to have this entry on this list is because of an email that I got from a subscriber. This person found me because of this drug series and felt compelled to not only share a list of the craziest drugs that he's tried, but he also wanted to share his experience specifically with GBL, as he says it was his worst withdrawal experience ever. And he also wanted to share words of caution for the viewers, all of which I'm going to share now. English isn't their first language, so forgive the grammatical errors. It happened like 5 years ago when I met my girlfriend. We were both living in Berlin. We were most active in the clubbing scene. I was prior to that addicted to opioids, so I was interested in trying GBL for the first time. The first time I took it, it felt like a mix of benzos and a bit of MDMA. The second time I took it, I just fell asleep and woke up 10 hours later confused on how I fell asleep. That's what's common when you take too much GBL. You pass out. So then I started doing GBL every day. Soon I noticed I can't sleep without it. It's literally impossible. So the problem with GBL is that when you're addicted to it, you will never fall asleep normally. You will need to take it every 2 hours to fall back asleep. So I woke up every 2 to 3 hours, took it, and then went back to sleep. My addiction went so horrible. I took 60 to 80 milliliters every day of GBL. That's enough to kill 10 people. This year I realized that I can't continue like that. I will die. I have had a few moments where I did almost die due to overdose on opioids, benzos, and GBL. I have had many close calls. I realized I just can't go on like that. Also, with GBL, you need to take it every hour. Otherwise, you are getting withdrawals. In my case, I took it every 5 or 10 minutes. And if I waited too long to take it, I would start to vomit extremely out of nowhere. It was just horrible. I started searching for a hospital here where they could do withdrawal for me. When I was in the hospital, I remember I took my last dose of GBL at 6 a.m. And then at 10 a.m., I suddenly forgot everything. I just don't remember much. I was in a delirium state. And the doctors told me I was super aggressive. I tried hitting them. I always tried to run away. And whenever I had IV drops attached to me, I always ripped them off because I thought they were poisoning me. Then the doctors told my parents we need to make him go into an induced coma. It's impossible to withdraw like this. They tried to put me into a coma but failed 3 times because I had a tolerance to the chemicals that they tried to give me. When it worked, I was in a coma for 1 week. And when I was in the coma, I had severe pneumonia in one lung and almost died there. Luckily, I didn't. After the coma, I was still there for another week. I have a few memories of what happened in those 2 weeks. I didn't even know I was in the hospital. I just thought I was in someone's basement. I thought I was on a Japan trip and a samurai chopped my head off. That's why I was in a basement, because they were trying to reattach it. I also saw a corpse lying in my bed. Then I saw a glimpse of me sitting in a chair while there was a woman under the chair trying to kill me. I also remember I saw snipers standing on the building near me, pointing guns at me. It felt so real, because I thought it was. I heard gunshots. Then whenever I looked at the wall, I saw bullet holes in the wall. There was also a voice in my head telling me to run away from this hospital because they were poisoning me and trying to kill me. So whenever my heart rate or anything else got dangerously high, I remember nurses running to me, and they would check on me, screaming, "Doctor, doctor." The doctor ran into the room and rammed me with a syringe in my leg because I was dying. I had an extreme seizure. I still have the memory of this seizure, like I was there. I also remember that I had so many seizures. It was like a 24/7 seizure. I couldn't really move, and it was like I was trapped in my body. My arms were always in the air, extremely shaking, but I couldn't move them. When the 2 weeks were over in the hospital, they sent me to a withdrawal clinic where I stayed 3 weeks. It was awful. I extremely shaked for 1 month. I couldn't even eat with a fork or spoon. I was so shaky. When I asked doctors what is wrong with me, they told me I had nerve damage. That really scared me. It took 4 months for the shaking to go away a bit, and I could live my life somewhat normally, but with complications. I still have tremors. Also, my memories are really bad. My short-term memory is awful, and I can't control my emotions, and I just burst out with emotions. I'm telling you this story about GBL because this drug is truly horrible. It's not just the effects that are dangerous, but it's also the withdrawal. You need to stay in an ICU unit in the hospital or you will die. My message to the RC community would be this: stay away from all of this stuff. There are almost no studies available on research chemicals. They are so potent and mostly unregulated. They can kill you super quick. Most of the time, research chemicals are 1,000 times the potency of similar drugs. Seek help and stay away from this stuff before it kills you. I have lost 4 super close friends because of those chemicals. It's a dangerous game, which you sadly can't win. It would be amazing if more people were aware of research chemicals and how extremely dangerous they were. I really appreciate this individual not only sharing their story, but sharing their words of warning as well. These videos are meant exclusively for education and entertainment purposes, and in no way, shape, or form do we advise any use of any illicit drugs at all. I hate to leave things on a negative note, but unfortunately, this is just the reality of these things. I appreciate you guys so much for watching this video, and if you guys are curious about other videos about crazy, deadly, and scary drugs, check out the playlist on screen. There's currently 3 other videos you may or may not have seen yet. I'll see you guys in the next one. Trust me, bro.